All right, boys. Welcome. Welcome to the January 7th, 2015 Open Crowbar Community Meeting. We've done a lot of work over the holiday season, directed towards two overall ideas, making it easier and easier to install Open Crowbar, and adding a new major feature, which is interaction with external services through Crowbar. So I wanted to start by opening up the discussion on services. What's like the high-level stuff for a newbie, and then get into the depth of the design. And I see that Greg has been working on a DNS service. So what's the general idea of a service?
So the idea of a service is to help with using Open Crowbar in a brown field or not perfect green field environment. You can't control everything within Open Crowbar. At least that's the beginning of why we thought about service. And what that means is, we'll talk about it in the context of DNS to start with for now. Say I have a DNS server that's mine, I already manage it, and I want everybody to use it. It'd be nice to be able to say, well, there's this service that everybody should use, including Crowbar, but Crowbar, don't install it, but just operate it. But make sure you point all my nodes at it and update it for the parts that you're operating on. We don't have an abstraction kind of mechanism for that. And so part of the thought is that services could be a way to decouple the installation, the endpoint service, and its management interface. So for example, say instead of wanting to run ISC's DHCP or a DNS server, you have a Power DNS server, or you've purchased a DNS service that has an API that would actually let you add and remove stuff. The goal of the services rework is to be able to say, okay, add this file to console, which tells the system about and registers the DNS service into something that it'll then use that information to populate clients. That takes care of the service deployment use kind of case. The next case is, how do we update it? Well, there's times where Crowbar wants to, because it knows, to update a mapping of an IP to a name. It'd be cool to have Crowbar operate on an abstracted API, like add name IP pair, right? Remove name IP pair is the basic API for dealing with DNS. And then Crowbar has a set of services, think of them as little shims, that provide that control function. That way it can be abstracted to be a set of chef calls that we already have to manage the ISC's DNS server bind, right? Or it becomes a little service that sits there and can drive Power DNS or whatever your service seems to be, and you abstract the little part that Crowbar needs to use to drive the DNS and move it. The idea is that this is applicable to almost all of our services. You could envision this for the DHCP service, the provisioner service, an NTP service, even maybe one day rethinking networking to be more like a networking service kind of thing. That way, the core moves to becoming a very small, not necessarily simple, but compact, tight orchestration, making sure attributes and services are met in a ordered mechanism. And then these small services, which are easier to test, easier to validate in isolation, can live in multiple places, make HA, all of this stuff, becomes easier to implement, where these services then can be spread out and managed independently. So that's the general idea behind services, right? And so the work I've been doing this last week or two has been around getting the first kind of model with the DNS bar clamp or DNS set of roles into the system. Out of band, Victor and I kind of had some discussions about how we would do some of this and where we would go with it. And our current thought, from a let's not just churn up the world kind of mechanism, was to maintain and use the existing node role functionality. And so we're not trying to introduce necessarily a new model at this point into the system, a service model, say. We're going to continue using the node role model so that its life cycle can continue to be a mechanism to control orchestration within the life cycle of both the service as well as the things that depend on that service. But that's led to a different side effect, that we now have this concept of system nodes, is what I'm calling them. I think Victor proposed phantom nodes. I'm probably going to change them to phantom nodes and create a phantom flag. And the idea is that a phantom node or a system node doesn't have a real thing behind it. It's not really a node. It doesn't have an IP address. It doesn't necessarily have those kind of things. But you can assign node roles to them. And the node roles then can do operations. Now, the implication is that you can't necessarily attach a node role that has a script jig or a chef jig, because those expect to go run on a system. But a no-op-based node role or a role-based node role could function quite well. And so in this implementation, what I've done is I've created a set of service roles that know how to use the role-based jig, which Victor added a month or two ago, to say that the role itself provides the jig functionality. And so when it runs, that service role attaches to console and does a set of queries to figure out if the service is available. So this points out another decision that's been made, or that we're playing with and testing out. We're using console as our service location kind of system. We're going to push services into console. So like the DNS server, when it's installed, the install process assumes that a console agent is running on that node, and that a console service registration file is dropped onto that agent, and then that's propagated out into the console universe. This has a couple of interesting consequences. One is the admin node doesn't have to be all these services anymore. Also means that we can start doing things like HA considerations, because we're going to have a service endpoint that's discovered through console, and it can maintain some of the checks and other stuff going forward to deal with failover, transition, and notifications. This is important because as we circle back to the service role, it sits and waits currently one time for the service to become available. When it becomes available, it records and puts that attribute into the system so that downstream node roles can operate on that information. Another enhancement to come is that those service roles will actually have a long-running communication that watches that service information, so that when it changes because of an outage or an HA event or whatever, that information gets propagated into that attribute, and then downstream node roles can be rerun to incorporate that new information if needed. Okay. Right, it's trying to maintain our orchestration-based concepts. Let's see.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I'm thinking where to go next on this. So that gives kind of where I am with it. And that's the service part. The next part that I kind of mentioned was a management service. And the idea is that DNS has two pieces. One is the actual operational service that DNS clients need. And then there's the management service piece, which is for when Crowbar needs to do something, or more accurately, when a downstream node role, or actually really any, needs to change DNS information. It would be nice if there were an API endpoint that you could look up, send the request to, and then get that back. And then that happened, and then you move on. Right now, for example, DNS updating is done by having a DNS role that sits downstream of just about everything, pays attention to node event changes, rebuilds the DNS database, and then generates queues up a call to a node role. Well, that's functional, that works. But it doesn't, it makes some assumptions, right? It assumes that the only way to change DNS is through our current chef system. Well, okay, if we were trying to integrate with Power DNS, for example, or some others, that's not necessarily true. I mean, we could wrap it into those recipes, but it seems like that's mixing more things than we necessarily want.
Yeah, kind of going the wrong way complexity-wise there.
Right, right. We just made a chef recipe that's kind of gnarly anyway, gnarlier.
So there might be, so you're splitting service management away from service configuration.
Correct. And the idea
really
that
service attribute configuration or service, yeah, they're setting up DNS and then they're setting up what DNS does.
Yeah, and strangely enough, this has actually moved it to a third category, which is definitely, don't get me wrong, a very blurry line between the construction of a service, the operation of a service, and the consumption of a service. And that's why I use DNS as an example, and some of the other ones like the provisioner is a much more blurry kind of environment here. But the idea is that there's the consumers of DNS, right? The DNS clients. They don't care. They just are going to go and say, hey, what's Google's IP address, right? And all they want is, you know, port 42 or whatever it is, right? And let me go. Give me an IP address, and I'm going to send port 42 requests, and I'm done, right? Then there's the actual building of the DNS server, right? I need to install bind, I need to get it installed, I need to get its init stuff set up, I need to make sure it's got loopback, you know, kind of domain set up, and potentially credentials around access, and it's, you know, installation and a very basic minimal configuration. And then and for some services, that's enough, right? In some regards, that's all that you expect from that service, and you're done. But then there's this in-between, which is kind of the operational part, which is, okay, well, I've got my server running, but I need to tweak it this way, or I need this added, or I need this taken care of. And some of the environments have APIs for this already. And we should take advantage of those when possible. some of them don't. In fact, it turns out most of them don't. That aren't just proprietary to the thing providing that service. So you could say, well, console has an API. Well, console actually is one of those examples that actually has a configuration API, an operational API, and a consumption API. And so in that regard, they've already separated those kind of concerns out. And so it makes sense to treat those three things separately. For DNS, they don't have an operational API. They just say, go muck with config files and deal with it. In the case of bind. In the case of like Power DNS,
we also see that in LDAP for the longest time. In order to configure an LDAP server, you had to do it through config files. But over the past several years, there's now cn equals config, where you can use LDAP to reconfigure your LDAP server.
Right. Yes. And so one of the things I think I'm wanting to at least move into the conversation with this kind of set of changes is the idea that in some cases, well, is to create this management service, which acts as an abstraction from that part. So that in Crowbar, particularly the core and among the roles, we can say, this is the DNS management API. This is currently what we understand how to do, and then we create a set of shims that know how to translate that API into the actual operational changes for the appropriate server in question. So the idea is that you could see or envision a Crowbar DNS server management shim, right, that implements the DNS management API that then knows how to run the node roles, or whatever, however we choose to implement it, changes to the DNS server's config files, bounces it, and away it goes, right? But that you could also then envision a kind of sibling level shim that manages Power DNS. It knows how to deal with the Crowbar API and maps it to the Power DNS API, because they actually have one, to do changes, right? And then it can handle the security credentials and all of that stuff to actually do the changes on Power DNS and do the mapping interaction there. The idea, but that's where we're headed. And so I've started the holders for these shims, and the next step in my process is to actually start building the shims and modifying the core to use the DNS API. Now, for some things, for example, NTP, if we were to servicize in NTP, for example, there's not a management API necessarily for NTP, right? It's set up a server, point clients at it. Set up your server as an in-between that can be pointed at and points upstream. All right, there's the breadth and depth of NTP operations, right? And so in that case, I wouldn't necessarily see shims being created for management. I would see an NTP service, right? NTP clients point at the NTP service, and then I would see our NTP server role have a configuration that says, that's my upstream or not, and then it drops into console and NTP service definition, and that's kind of the extent, right? That one's simple in some regards in my mind. I chose to start with DNS because I think it was not as complex as, say, the provisioner, because the provisioner adds potential.
The provisioner is going to take a lot more work.
yeah, it's a lot more work. It presents a lot more problems of service interaction between DHCP, DNS, the provisioner itself, the networking subsystem, right? All those kind of sets of things get lumped together in dealing with the provisioner. I was hoping to avoid most of those discussions with the DNS. Networking's reared its head into this one because we do a lot of apparently stuff by name resolution, which is fine. So it means that DNS has to work all the time for us most of the time. And so there's some tweaks that I'm having to do with the networking pieces to make them more resilient and making sure routes are in place and some other things that aren't necessarily guaranteed in our previous model. I think in the end it'll be a net win, but it's just some gyrations to go through.
Speaking of gyrations, as I was learning Systemd and reading between the lines, I saw it as something that's going to make available as an API the entire init system and hardware management and service management on the Linux operating system level. Have you guys tossed around any ideas like that to either copy or take advantage of some of the things that Systemd is using in order to, say, help manage processes and create services and evanescent services and things like that?
That's where I did an experimental port of the Docker admin container to running in CentOS 7 with Systemd as our init process. So I did some stuff along those lines, but I had to back it out because it turns out that while you can run a container using Systemd just fine under Arch, CentOS 7, current Fedora, and current Fedora, you can't do it if you happen to be running on top of CentOS 6 or RHEL 6 or Ubuntu 12.04. So I had to back some of that stuff out.
Yeah, which we may want to push through anyway and just say people on 12.04 move up to, well, the Cent 6 is the problem, but
yeah,
12.04 is dead and should go away.
Well, that's the problem. It's not dead. It's still supported. LTS.
Not 12.04, right? 12.04 I thought was dead.
Yeah, 12.04 is still supported.
5 years.
5 years.
Okay. Sorry. Never mind. Yeah.
In 2 years, we won't have to worry about it.
Yeah, there we go. The other, my comment on the Systemd aspect is that parts of the role system and its dependencies are beginning to look, or you can say which came first and whatever, but they're beginning to look similar with regards to some of their operations. Now,
that's not surprising, given I actually watched an interview that involved that Leonard was talking about Systemd over the Christmas holidays, and it turns out he uses kind of the same underlying idea of expressing all the dependencies between the services as a DAG that I did for Crowbar. So
right.
It's not surprising that they kind of look alike.
Yeah, I mean we've had the DAG concept, right, of roles and queues and pulling them. It's kind of what we've always thought it needed to be. It's just been enhanced and improved and made much more robust and expressible, right? And Systemd is moving in that direction too. And so it's kind of funny. Now, the interesting part is that we're trying to do it remotely. So in some regards, I think a more apt description is Systemd and FleetD, or FleetD on top of a Systemd-enabled system, as a similar-ish idea where FleetD is actually using etcd as its shared area, like we're using our Postgres database and console. I don't necessarily think that's bad. I think given what we're trying to achieve, I think our separation of not necessarily tying directly into the Systemd system or components is actually a good thing. especially as we begin to look at dealing with things, right? Some OSs won't have systemd. And then on top of that, if as you could long-term envision trying to manage things that aren't necessarily systems.
Yeah, well, there's also I could name one very popular operating system that will never have systemd.
Right.
Just one.
Right. And so in that regard, I think we should be looking at systemd for some things. For example, one of my networking problems that I've been thinking about is that we depend on the admin network everywhere. Really, most of the time, I don't necessarily want an admin network. What I want is some network, right? Now, that's a future statement a little bit in the sense that right now, a lot of our system is highly dependent upon an admin network. Though some of these changes, I'm finding that the admin network is more of a provisioning network and not necessarily, right, but it's...
There's that, and it's I've actually been doing a lot of thinking along these lines too. And it's not so much that we're dependent on an admin network as we are dependent on a reliable way to reach out and get into a system.
Right. Yes, that's an example.
The way we ensure that we do that is by having an admin network and by making sure that we're in charge of handing out the IP addresses. That way we can always know what IP a system has to get into it.
Right.
Unfortunately, all the ways that I can think about that would let us do away with having that level of control involve either more competency than I think we can realistically expect from customers in setting up their networking, or having an agent on the box.
Yes, that's true. I agree with that. Right, I can see where that would be a problem. Yeah, so my in-between stance of that, because I kind of knew Victor was thinking about some of these things, was to take potentially a page from the systemd kind of script setup or dependency setup. So what they actually have is they have roles that are things like needs all networking and needs a network, and then have things like the admin network provides a network, right? So that gets satisfied, and then create a role, a no-op role that acts as a focal point that says all the networking that we know about is configured, right? And that when we add an admin network role, it automatically adds itself as a parent to the all networking configured node role for that node. That way, downstreams don't necessarily, if they care about a specific network, then they can reference it directly. But if they just care about assuming a network is configured and that we do the in-between trust that the customer has set up that the a network, the starting network or whatever, is at least routable to the services, which I know still may be a stretch, then at least the services don't necessarily have to be dependent upon these provisioner networks or these admin networks and other specific networks. This also is somewhat based upon my dealing with and thinking through, okay, what are we going to do in a brownfield situation where we don't get to touch their network that much?
Yeah,
right?
That's what was motivating my concern.
Yeah, right. Where I'm going to be able to glean an address maybe from a set of DHCP requests at some point, or a node role run at a later date. But okay. So I haven't chosen to tackle the gleaning part. I've just chosen to try and tackle some of the disassociation from specific networks to a network without losing the ability to care about a specific network. I think that's actually still a valuable component that we can use and should use, particularly for things like as you talk about OpenStack deployments down the road, right? or even Hadoop deployments and other stuff like that, where they have separate specific networks that you could manage specifically, right? That you need this address goes to here. I'm going to associate it this way. I don't want to run this role until that network shows up, right? Okay, that's still, I think, a useful and powerful tool that Crowbar has. I think for some of the bring up cases, it's less that way. But I don't know. That's my current headache right now, is dealing with the routability problems. Anyway, that was a lot of babbling about services.
Do we have any sort of deadline or hopes of when we're going to have a solid notion of an abstracted service for, say, DNS? Do we have a goal in mind?
So I can do, I'm going to do a pull request. I need to reorganize it a little bit. The idea is to do a non-necessarily pullable pull request to let people see what I've done and the modifications made so far to the system for the service abstraction piece, with the empty shell of some of the roles for the management service stuff. Then my thought is to then start working on the management services piece to discover more of what's going on there. I need to, one of the thoughts is to build these shims in Go, to have them be little RESTful API servers sitting at wherever we want them to. And then Crowbar can install them as needed or manage them through our normal process, right? And so these guys get their own kind of installation service component pieces. And then that's a little Go service that runs next to the DNS server in our bind case. In the case of Power DNS, it may be something that you spin up on the admin node with the right credentials pointing at the external Power DNS server, right? Mm-hmm. As an example. So in some regards, it's a whole new little service thing. But I need to learn myself some Go and building and organizing.
You pick it up fast. Go is an easy language to learn, deliberately so.
Yeah, it's just time, all right? It's time and mechanism, and figuring out what to steal and what needs to be written. I was seeing that there's, and I'll probably talk with Victor some about it, what's safe to steal or what fork and use. Because like I found somebody wrote some RESTful web service shells, right? Where you just plug in your functions for what you want to happen when you do these calls. Well, okay, that's a great place to start.
Sort of like a Sinatra, a micro HTTP RESTful thing?
Well, everyone writes one of those pretty much because it's so easy to do, and everyone wants to have their solution flavored the way they want.
So then there's security on top of that, right? So what I'm wanting to do is try and at least make sure that we have some security model between the shim and the Crowbar core server. And so part of that's going into this too, right?
And that's a lot of what I've been kind of getting all paranoid about in the background too.
Agreed.
As we decompose into independent services, we need to have real security between them, and we may as well bake it in from the start and not do it half-assedly.
Exactly. That's where my head was. I think Open Crowbar needs to start having a security focus to it. And we have pieces, we have some known holes. I mean, I think we have some security issues, right? I think there's some glaring things that we need to fix. I think overall we're not horrid, but I think there's some specific places that need some love. And then I think new things,
there are places we could drive a truck through things. But I mean, among the other things is we need to at least have some sort of PKI infrastructure.
Yeah.
And we need to have a much more robust user model.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah, I haven't even, right.
Because one of the directions that I'd like to go is to, instead of having the single machine install username and password that basically has unlimited ability to do damn near everything, the way that I'd like to move is more in towards of the way that machine domain membership works in the Windows land, where every system is essentially a user that is has a specially managed password that has a special password and credential management with its own rights constellations and everything.
Yeah, I agree. That's some of the stuff that we undid a little bit in my.
We're kind of hamstrung by our use of devise, which is pretty tightly focused on users being people on the internet.
Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah, that was part of the install rework. Was I was pulling out that Crowbar node scripts, and its purpose was to start giving us a place to put that kind of join me, give me a unique password, let me know my access credentials to this set, right?
I mean, frankly, that seems like a good place to drop Caribou and LDAP into the system, or a solution like that, or the solution, or like Keystone or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, there's even Go implementations of LDAP servers, so that should be that would be a lot of fun for me, knowing the protocol by heart.
We don't need a full-blown open LDAP installation with all the whistles and bells and all that BS. We just need something that'll be just enough to do our job. And directory lookup of machines and users that's kind of right up LDAP's alley. Ideally, we'd want it to be able to we'd want it to be able to integrate with other LDAP servers in Active Directory at some point, though.
Right. I've done a whole bunch of.
We don't want to make it impossible.
I've done a whole bunch of LDAP pass-through to Active Directory authentication. So if you're coming into a corporate environment, you want to be able to give all your junior admins some sort of access to Crowbar, passing through our own LDAP server into the Active Directory for credentials. Makes life a lot easier. And then you can manage your own AAA without having to actually manage credentials.
Exactly.
Yay.
It is unfortunately the ugly but work solution.
Well, yeah. And I think we're going to see more and more requests for this as.
Yeah, when you're enterprisey, you got to have it.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be the next fire drill, and moving to having not like everything's a fire drill, but I think the system stuff gives us an opportunity to start addressing some of the security issues in the quote right way.
Absolutely.
Which is secured services and stuff like that. So.
Yeah.
Okay, back up to our agenda. Do you guys have time to review the installation changes?
Well, along the way, I made it so that it works exactly the same way that it used to, but having different underneath of it.
Yeah. And all this currently is in the development branch. It hasn't been validated and tested out enough for us to push to a release branch. So think of it as Camshaft 1 baking.
Yeah. The upshot of the changes basically boil down to production.sh just being a very stupid wrapper that calls 5 scripts in a row now.
Going to be more, hopefully, one day.
Yeah, which do the same work that production.sh used to do.
Yeah.
Does it call them in a row, or are some parallelized?
No, they're in a row.
They're all in a row, right? Yeah.
Parallelizing shell scripts is it's great if you want to hurt your brain. Believe me, I've done it.
Oh yeah. But they've been broken down into 5 scripts to allow some to be used. I'm asking, are they broken down to be used, some in the Docker admin and others in an RPM install?
So this is the other aspect of the services work becomes to get to the point of saying, I don't want all this on one system. I want to be able to set up a HA-capable system. I want to be able to set up a scalable system. I want to be able to set up a distributed system, right? So part of the construction of these scripts is production.sh, while somewhat poorly named in some regards, or no longer representatively named, I guess, is whatever. The idea is that production.sh is a great way for us to get everything we need running. Now, if I were going to do this in production, I would probably want to put my database server somewhere else. And so some of the new scripts are install database server, install console, right? And the idea is that as we move to a multi-node deployment, as we move to HA environments, as we want to turn things on or off, or reuse existing things in a user's environment, customer's environment, the goal is that production.sh isn't necessarily what you would use. You would use a install console, install database on the database server. Then you would use the install console, install the core on what's going to be your core admin server, right? Then, depending on usage and other stuff, you may choose to set up 2 provisioners, right? One for rack in one part of my data center and one for a rack in another part of my data center. That would still use the same set of components, right? The idea is that we're trying to break some of this up to give more flexibility around the actual deployment of Open Crowbar and all of its 9 services or whatever it is that it kind of needs to do its initial job.
And you might be skipping some of these scripts if you have them running as services on another node that you could just then point Crowbar to, correct?
Correct. Or, yeah, exactly. Right.
Cool.
So it's an attempt to continue making Open Crowbar a little more palatable to the brownfield case, where I have some stuff already. While still maintaining the ease of development, right? So part of the whole existence of production.sh, and it's highly useful for development purposes, is that you can spin up an admin node in a Docker container still with the general flow of the whole system in, under 5 minutes.
If
FTP.edu
is behaving nicely.
Yeah, assuming the University of Texas isn't screwing with you today.
Not on my network, not ever. Thanks. That's really helpful. Has this work been integrated into been useful in creating the RPMs? and what's up with the RPMs?
Okay, so for the RPMs, master currently has a set of RPM installs and a Crowbar install script that you can use that will take if you have a CentOS 6.5 system, it will basically wget the install script, build the repos, and then pull the RPMs, do the appropriate tweaks to your admin node. Coming back to our security comment, right, we turn off SysLinux or SE Linux, and we turn off firewalls. Two things we probably don't want to just do blatantly if we're claiming some level of security.
We still use passwords, so we're secure.
Yeah, exactly. They're all Crowbar though. So right now we do those tweaks, and then it goes off and does the installation. In the end, you run production.sh by hand, and after you get all the RPMs that you want installed, so the idea is that hardware is a separate RPM, you can pull it in. If you want to try the PackStack RPM from Rackin, you can ask us, and that one's kind of available for anybody to pull in, and it's also done through an RPM, right? So that kind of stuff is there, and that works. We validated that. Scott's been running that periodically. I have that run nightly-ish if I remember to turn off my existing admin node on my system, and it mostly works. The current failures are almost always because the University of Texas is having issues with their FTP servers, or I left my Docker container running. To try and facilitate RPM usage going forward, there's now a development set of RPMs that I build periodically. So after major check-ins, like after Victor's rearranging of and mine rearranging of the production SH script stuff, I added the ability to choose which one you wanted in the install script. So if you now pass --develop, it'll actually choose development-based repos that are built out of the develop branch. So in fact, I think what is out there right now is the tip of the branch right now. There's not been any commits recently. I'm not sure it functions correctly because Scott tried it and found some issues. So I'll push some changes for that. Well, he found an issue. The issue was his setup, but he also found some bugs. The bugs may not be catastrophic to installation. So anyway, actually, I don't think they are. I think they just mess with how you look up localhost. But anyway, that's the state of the RPMs, and the scripts are set up. So like the development tree. Oh, an important side effect of the previous change that Victor didn't mention is it converts our base system to CentOS 6.6.
I don't actually know how important that is to mention.
Well, Scott tried it and it breaks on 6.5. So you do need to be 6.6, but the script, the docs in the development tree have been updated to work with 6.6 and stuff. The RPMs don't really change, but the underlying systems and its desires do a little bit. Oh, and if you'd used the RPM repo before, there was a Ruby RPM stuffed inside of the Open Crowbar repo. Victor split that out so that Ruby is in its own Open Crowbar Ruby repo, so that if we ever get to an operating system update that supports Ruby 2, we will drop that repo without necessarily having to affect the other repos.
Hallelujah.
Yes. May it come quickly. Though it doesn't look like it's going to happen soon.
Well, CentOS 7 is running Ruby 2 by default, correct?
Yes. CentOS 7 would be a solution to this problem.
Yep, and when I did CentOS 7, I did not use our hand-built Ruby RPM. And it worked great. But I had to roll those changes back for other reasons.
And the reason, I mean, that's mainly the Docker reason, right?
Yeah, the reason was mainly the workarounds that I had to use to get Docker to allow systemd to work inside of it. Didn't work on Ubuntu 12.04. And
Right.
that's what Rob is still using, and I don't want to inconvenience him too much.
Yeah. We should debate that at some future discussion, because...
Yeah, but it wasn't worth the debate then.
No, it's not a debate. No. We should debate that in the sense that we should probably declare it, and then I'll go fix Rob. Well, I mean, if you think about it, right now, the development community is us, right? The three of us plus Rob. And three of us, I don't think, are running an unsupported operating system, right? Or if we are, it's easy enough for us to fix that problem, for the most part. And dealing with Rob is dealing with Rob, and we can fix that, right? If that's the only other person that's having this problem. And in some regards, I think it makes some of the Docker installation stuff cleaner, easier. Docker's better supported on 12.04, like 14.04 and CentOS 7 anyway. So it's one of those, we may just want to bite that bullet and move it forward. But like I said, the debate for another session.
One last question for the RPM land. Have we been testing against RHEL? I know it's supposed to be bit for bit
We have
equal
not.
to CentOS. But
We have not.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Might be something we want to pick up later on. I'll see if I can get some licenses.
Yeah.
Has
That's
licensing been an issue?
That's my main constraint. I don't have a RHEL license or Red Hat Enterprise Linux license.
I'll ask for one. And that'll make that that. Hi, I'm the Open Crowbar Project. Can I have a license to RHEL? Just one or two, please. All right. Thank you guys for bearing with me for starting late. Is there anything else folks want to chime in on before this is committed to posterity?
I need a glass of water. I did way too much talking. Sorry about that.
No, you did a great amount. It was really super helpful. I took copious notes, and
Yes, thank you for taking notes, Fred.
The world will be greatly enlightened by all that we have to offer.
I may lift some of those notes and put them in some other things.
Excellent. I will be posting these notes somewhere for the world to see soon. All right. With that, live long and prosper, and the needs of the crowbar outweigh the needs of the few, or the many, or the one.
For the 1 minute.
They just outweigh all the needs.
All right.
Okay. Have a great
Take care,
day, guys. Thanks. Bye.
All right.